The most important thing is to understand the action that you would like to take. If you look at food procurement, or you look at transport, or you look at energy itself and construction, you've got the big areas where carbon is being emitted, and it is being committed for the long term into the supply chain. As with all data sets, all data is bad, because you have to marry your ambition for analysis to the actuality of your data. Ourselves and others who gathered evidence during COVID that will hopefully contribute to a better understanding of how to run state functions in a pandemic. Timing and action all come together to generate the insight.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles. And joining us today is Ian Makgill, the founder of Spend Network. Ian and his company are on a mission to improve the global procurement market, particularly in the public sector. Spend Network's website boldly claims that it can help users to unlock the $13 trillion global procurement market through the world's leading tender, contract, spend and grant data. That's about 13% of the global economy. Throughout his career, building databases for 20 years and working with AI for 6, Ian has been a passionate believer that data can shape our world for the better. While it often feels as if data is used to point at stuff that's happened, and happened in a bad way, or show where everybody else is failing, Ian is committed to telling stories of how his organisation is using data to shape the future. Ian, welcome to the Data Malarkey podcast.
Sam, thank you. That was a very generous introduction, quite humbling, but thank you very, very much.
Well, listen, it's great to have you with us, and I trust that was a good summary of who you are and what you do. Is there anything that you'd like to add about how you came to found Spend Network and maybe also Open Ops, the global tender alerting service too? Is there anything I've got wrong?
No, I don't think so. It is 13 trillion that governments spend with their suppliers, and that's really what we're engaged in, trying to understand that market. So I think you're 100% there. I think I am surprised sometimes by the audacity, perhaps, of my own goal, which is to try and understand all of that.
Big, hairy, audacious goals are what we're all about here on Data Malarkey.
Well, exactly.
So before we get down and dirty with data, let's go beyond the day job and start with a question that's designed to get to the heart of you. It doesn't at all necessarily ask you to tell us about your work. So tell me, Ian, first of all, how do you spend your time?
Well, outside of work, I'm very lucky. I have a family. We live by the seaside on the south coast of England. So time is spent, in between taking kids to rugby matches and cricket matches and all of those lovely things and netball practice. We do, I've got walk the dogs on the beach, and we enjoy reading theatre. And when it's windy, I like to go windsurfing.
Very good. Excellent. You're making proper use of the terrain around you. Let's zoom in and focus on what you do with Spend Network and the global procurement market. Can you explain what role data plays for you in your day-to-day work?
So it is literally all of my work is about data, either in terms of how we gather it and process it, or store it, through to how we present it and analyze it, or how we make it accessible to customers through user interfaces, those kind of things. And then, of course, how we change it, manipulate it using AI.
And can you describe what sort of data is the most important to you in your work?
So typically, we gather, the bulk of what we gather is either a request, a detail of what someone is going to buy or what they're planning to buy, or a commitment in the form of a contract or a spend item. So, but typically, who is buying what and how much they're paying to who? Those are the really core bits of what we analyze.
And this, when we've spoken before, you've said it might be haircuts in Mexican jails or airports in China. This is really anything that governments are spending money on. I'm interested because before I started my own business about 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago, I was always slightly irritated to get that kind of to quote a Status Quo song, that shows my generation, doesn't it? The Dear John letter, or the Dear John email. Thank you so much for taking part in our competitive tender. Unfortunately, you came a close second. It was an extremely high quality field. We've got your details on file. So, frankly, the standard letter. In the data that you capture, are you ever able to go kind of beyond that kind of Dear John kiss-off? Are you able to get the reasons why contractor A won the bid and contractor B didn't? And are you then able to aggregate that to give those who might be tendering for business a bit more of a clue on what to do next time?
I think that's a really, really interesting question. And I think to say we could do it every time would be unfair. But in a lot of cases, yes, we can. What you're really looking for in that concept is patterns of award and predictability, how likely it is that one supplier might win over another. And there are patterns that we're seeing around whether you're an incumbent, whether you have good case studies, those kind of things that will allow us to either before an event predict to some degree of confidence your chances of winning, but also actually after an event, when you understand who did win, what was the key factor driving that. Of course, we don't get to see everyone's bids, so we can't actually know if someone, as they say, bought the business. They decided to serve that contract at a loss in order to try and drive up pricing elsewhere or make profit at another time.
I well remember a guy I used to work with who lived 6 months of the year in his native Bahamas. And all of the work that he did was design and print work for the European Union. He's long since retired, but he said, I've got a magic formula and I ain't telling nobody. What I like about the ambition of Spend Network is that you might be able to get kind of behind that secret sauce. Now tell us, I want to know what kind of challenges you face in ensuring that the data you gather is as complete and clean and as aligned as possible. Do you have to go to particular great lengths to ensure that the data you gather is usable and useful to your subscribers?
We do. It is the sort of bulk of the work that we do, trying to identify the sources, gather the data, and then map it to a common standard. It's a huge amount of work. We gather data from 700 sources every day. So just that alone is a sort of engineering challenge. And then, of course, as with all data sets, all data is bad because you have to marry your ambition for analysis to the actuality of your data. And your ambition will always outstrip the data that you have, whatever. So we do spend a lot of time trying to bring stuff together, and to use a technical term, we talk about entity reconciliation, just trying to make sure that we kind of can try and cut off the limit of the human imagination when it comes to naming an organization. So any person putting in the council name or the university name into a tender portal can find new ways of putting that in. We kind of bring that all together, and so that the Department for Work and Pensions is always the Department for Work and Pensions, and to make that data analyzable. So those are the sort of things that we do.
I'm always really interested in what organizations can do in terms of moving from data to insight, genuine transformational insight, profound and useful understanding, and then from insight to action. I think often individuals, teams, whole organizations can get stuck in the weeds, stuck in the mud in moving from so what do the data mean to this aha, and then now what can we do as a result? Can you tell me what steps you take to move from data to insight and then insight to action?
So I think the most important thing is to understand the action that you would like to take. So, for example, a new tender is published and I want to bid on that tender. Then I need to present the data in such a way as it makes it easy to identify, find that tender. So we have to create products or services that align with our customers' actions. So we always try and be action focused. For example, we're doing some work with the Scottish Government at the moment, which is about identifying carbon output, estimating carbon outputs from given contracts. And so we know that then the action that they want to take is to put up a new specification in the following renewal of that contract that allows them to reduce the carbon. So timing and action all come together to generate the insight. Now, what you have with data, and I'm sure with a lot of your guests on this podcast, is that kind of notion that something should be possible, but you don't know if it's possible until you sort of worked out the insight. And you have to go on, I think what would be slightly unfair to call fishing expeditions, but you do have to muck around with this data and push it into places where you don't know if you're going to get an output. You don't know if it's going to work. So experimentation, if you will, that allows us to say, actually, in theory, we should be able to do this, I think is a really important part of the work that we do.
That sounds like hypothesis testing rather than hypothesis proving. It sounds like, to me, I think my statistics professors would let you off there. But I mean, what it sounds like you're not doing is starting with an a priori hypothesis and saying, right, where are we going to find the data that shows this? You're saying, we've got this idea, let's see if the data allows that to stand up. And presumably you'll quite often have to reject that hypothesis.
Yeah. So what we tend to end up with is we end up with a kind of, can we link this? But actually, in some ways, we get to test the hypothesis at a fairly early stage and go, yeah, it works. Then our big problem is, can we scale it to a product size, or can we scale it to a point where it is useful across a large enough number of organizations, or at has that use case that can be completed? Because if I can give you the carbon rankings for 20% of the contracts, that's no good. You have to do it for all of them.
I know that you've got a passion for, I mentioned this in the introduction, a passion telling stories about data kind of shaping the future. In that example of the Scottish government you've started to talk about, they're kind of using data to tackle climate change. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And maybe specifically, is that every single tender that the Scottish government is now putting out to tender needs to have a climate change element in it?
So the Scottish government are working hard to encourage their buyers to consider the output of carbon in their procurement. And they're setting up rules. I don't know precisely whether they have introduced new rules around reporting on carbon, but I do know that they are very keen to try and understand and prioritize. I mean, there is very little merit in turning around and saying, can I reduce the carbon on a small consultancy project or a bit of architectural design? There isn't a lot of carbon emitted there. However, if you look at food procurement, or you look at transport, or you look at energy itself and construction, you've got the big areas where carbon is being emitted, and it is being committed for the long term into the supply chain. So those are the sorts of things that they're looking at. They're saying, actually, I know these contracts are coming up for renewal, and it is much better for me to, for example, demand that 20% of journeys in a taxi contract are done using electric cars than to worry about my consulting contracts. So I think it's about what we're helping them to do is prioritize their how they look at different problems and emissions and how they solve those going forwards.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, I don't know whether they talk about gold, silver, and bronze, or red, amber, green, but I agree with you that I mean, as a consultant who deals in pixels and an occasional bit of printing and not very much else, I personally sometimes find those blanket requirements to have a full environmental statement for the impact that the business has when that impact is next to nothing. I find that just in order to be able to get through the next hoop, I find that to be kind of slightly onerous. But, that's just because, we polish our halos here at Incitations quite clearly. I've mentioned about you and that you've been experimenting with AI for half a dozen years now. although you say with some humility, you're often doing this unsuccessfully. I really love the kind of spirit of both curiosity and adventure and kind of trial and error, I guess, that you clearly you embrace and you embrace in your teams. Are you a passionate advocate of using AI to make smarter use of data? And I maybe wonder what you feel about what your practical and emotional reaction is to this new generation of particularly generative AI tools that seem to be popping up by the day.
I think my reaction is very similar to most people's reaction in particularly around Chat GPT 3.5 onwards. I spoke to a professor of artificial intelligence who looked at the challenges and was looking at AI obviously every day, and he said, "Okay, we were all blown away with what happened in 12 to 14 months ago." So I think we're all both infused and terrified at the same time. You can see the potential. The potential is obvious in many ways, but the fear is also real. Am I still going to have a job? Is the natural consequence? Am I still going to have a business? Where I think we see the movement of AI in data, which I think is really interesting, is the possibility of, if you build data into vectorized databases, that adjacent matching of records becomes much easier. So you have that possibility to say, I'm actually going to cluster all of the tenders that belong to the Department for Work and Pensions without actually having to do the matching. And I think that sort of the human cognition as an attribute being applied to data could make our data analysis by, multiple times more efficient. There are other things around improving the way systems are managed and spotting errors and things like that AI will be very good at. So I think those things are very exciting. I'm not I don't understand the challenges of AGI and, artificial general intelligence and the philosophy behind it. So I'm not really, I have to think about it in terms of my day-to-day work. But I think it's a really exciting time, and auto-gen is going to be very, very relevant to procurement.
Very good. I recently started experimenting with Perplexity. I don't know if you've come across Perplexity. If not, I strongly recommend you have a look. I think it makes Google entirely irrelevant. So the quality of the responses that it gives to even very badly worded prompts. The kind of the frustration that there was with kind of Google 1.0 or with that when there were so many browsers that you would get stuff that was vaguely related. Actually, the quality of responses and the fact that it puts citations and links, that kind of gets over even the GPT-4 hallucinations. I would strongly recommend Perplexity. I have no axe to grind. It's also completely free. If it's as good as it appears to be, it will be swamped and be charging a fee within minutes. The other thing that you make me think of is a previous guest on this podcast, Professor Angela Gallup, who's one of the world's finest forensic scientists. She's in her 70s now, but one of her first forensic science case working out of North Yorkshire was a Peter Sutcliffe Yorkshire Ripper case, the famous or notorious serial killer from the 70s and 80s. And both speaking to her and also speaking to the former head of West Yorkshire Police, a guy called Chris Gregg, who revolutionized policing and the use of data in policing, and partly by the way they ask questions, partly by the use of data, post-Sutcliffe. Because you may or may not know this, and listeners and viewers may or may not know this, this notorious serial killer was interviewed by police 8 times before he was finally arrested. He was very clever, very wily. One of the reasons for that is that the data existed on not punch cards, but pieces of card in separate police stations all over Yorkshire, well, North, West and South Yorkshire, 3 of the biggest counties in the UK, and they were never aligned. And you're talking about bringing things together, this entity reconciliation, doing things, spotting patterns, kind of automatically joining up, aligning the stars, I think is very, very exciting. But like you, I think there will probably be some downsides as well as some upsides. Now, talking about downsides, I want to know, Ian, what's the worst example of a misuse of data that you've ever observed, either in your own work or maybe perhaps more broadly in the public domain?
Well, I have to. I might be showing my cards a little bit here about my personal opinions, but one of the pieces of work that I think most rattled my cage the most was a consultation issued by the Cabinet Office as a post-Brexit consultation to bring back imperial measures. And within the consultation, you were given the choice to either have imperial measures and metric measures or imperial measures. There was no choice to retain our common status of metric measures on their own. So, and you think of this as it was. I think the worst thing about it was that it was clearly a minister trying to influence what should be a really sensible bit of the state managing an economy. And if you think about the possible consequences of ensuring that imperial measures gets printed on every product that has a weight associated with it, and recalibrating scales across every supermarket and every place where you weigh product, coffee houses, whatever, across the UK, you realise that the sheer bloody-mindedness that is, preventing people from saying, please, we don't want to change this. We've got it. It works. Keep going. So that is my top example of a really appalling use of data.
You opened my eyes to that one, and you haven't outed him, but I'm going to say that this is the work of the egregious Jacob Rees-Mogg, formerly leader of the House under the Johnson junta. Not that I'm revealing my cards there at all. But yeah, we'll include a link. There's a very good piece, predictably enough, from the UK Guardian. There's a very, very good piece about that. We'll include a link to that in the show notes. Looking more positively on the flip side of that coin, do you have an example of a really positive and good use of data? I know that you're a strong advocate of using data in a positive way. Any good examples you'd like to share?
I've been thinking about this, and I really think that some of the work that was done on COVID and analysis of the data in relation to COVID, in the open, out loud work where people were saying, here are the shortcomings, I really thought was very impressive. And the work that was done in Taiwan and South Korea, putting up case maps literally overnight. South Korea have this very interesting minister for digital who was able to work with hackers overnight one night, just on a Reddit group, to put up a lot of maps for case rates and concern to help citizens understand where they could get tests and other things. So really, really impressive work. And that was done for free overnight by a bunch of hackers. At the same time, you've got John Burton Murdoch at the FT, who really delved right into the difficulty of getting data. And he started with the sort of trying to estimate case rates and got quite sophisticated charts and fan charts and things going. And then actually very quickly, I think in consequence, started measuring excess deaths around COVID, because it was a much, much more reliable mechanism for understanding the pandemic. So he'd done all of this work that was really quite sophisticated, and he just went, no, we can't rely on it. It's not good enough data. I'm going to go to a simpler but more illustrative version. I thought that was really interesting. There's a really being led by the quality of the data and the quality of analysis was very, very important. And I thought that, they were John Murdoch. If you don't follow him in the FT, do, because he's a really insightful data analyst and journalist.
I completely agree with you about him. I was speaking at a conference on data communications last May, and he gave the opening keynote, and I thought his work was transformational. I agree with you. I think that in terms of data under COVID, I mean, I think one of the brilliant things about COVID, and there were many hideous, appalling things that at the time that we're speaking, the whole COVID inquiry is happening in the UK, which is showing quite the shortcomings. I think actually the very day we're recording, the disgraced former Health Secretary Matt Hancock is giving his first of possibly 4 days of evidence. Anyway, I think that Professor David Spiegelhalter at Cambridge, he had a good pandemic, wrote a really good book called COVID by Numbers. And in terms of the data visualization, I think your Korean example is brilliant. I think John Hopkins, just in terms of aggregating stuff, did a great job. And also the Information is Beautiful guys, David McCandless, who used to run the Guardian's Data Lab, they did some, in terms of explaining relative and absolute risk, which it transpires from the COVID inquiry, our Prime Minister didn't understand the difference between relative and absolute risk, but that's another story. I think in terms of explaining that, what is the difference? I think that for public knowledge, driven by people like John Murdoch in particular, is one tiny crumb of positive to come out of an otherwise very black time. Let's thinking about effective communication in. Go ahead.
I was just going to add, we've actually been in touch with the COVID inquiry, and some of our data, we hope, will be used as part of the evidence because we know exactly what was published when, and that's not necessarily available in the public websites. There's a possibility, I hope, a very real possibility, that our data will be presented as evidence towards the COVID inquiry. And so I think that that's a really, this idea that businesses can sit outside of the working. I don't think it's true. I think we can really get involved as long as we're talking about facts. And I welcome the kind of possibility that the work of these ourselves and others who gathered evidence during COVID that will hopefully contribute to a better understanding of how to run state functions in a pandemic.
That's really interesting. So this is data about contracts that were and weren't tendered for PPE and everything else that we can recall that may or may not have been given on a whim to Dominic Cummings' friends or university mates. So this is about public sector tenders that were very much in the news, is it?
Yeah, and obviously, we have to be understanding. If I was running Newcastle City Council and I wanted to get hold of PPE, I might have something else to worry about rather than publishing a contract award notice at that time. Or if I was in the Health Trust trying to understand. So there is a tolerance here where we're saying, look, it was right. But then there's when does it slide into obfuscation and a failure to be candid? So that's the new sort of thing. But then what was bought as well, it's quite interesting. A lot of money went to consultancies.
How it's possible to spend 22 billion on the Test and Trace app. I don't know how the accountants in the big consultancies that invoiced that amount kind of had the barefaced cheek to do it, but that's not. Anyway, listen. It'll be a few months before this episode comes out, so please let us know. Whether the episode's out or not, but please let us know how your data is used by the inquiry, because although many mistakes were made, I think it's one very good consequence that we are having this inquiry, and it'd be really interesting to see that data can play a role in unpicking some of that.
I'll follow up with one very quick thing to add on at the end of that. The difference between that 22 billion that didn't succeed and the rollout of the vaccine that did succeed is that we had a pre-existing database that was relied upon on our health records. And that database could be used to build a service on top of. So, and extrapolating this out to a wider data malarkey thing, do not try and build services on top of non-existing data sources. You need to have a reliable mechanism for recording changes, implementing updates, all of those sort of things in order to run any kind of service, commercial or governmental. You need a really good database today. And if you don't, you end up with a $2 billion bill.
Really, really important learnings. Thinking about effective communication, maybe not so much in terms of visualization, but what do you believe, because you're doing this all the time, what do you believe is the best way to combine narrative and numbers in effective storytelling?
I'll be honest, it's an area that we, one of the reasons I speak to you is because we need to get better at it. It's something that I think everyone who loves data or understands data and works with it gets drawn into this idea that actually, if I just present more numbers, if I can fit more numbers on my slide, then I'm going to be able to communicate more importantly, when in fact, or an important fact, where in fact the converse is true, the opposite is true. We have this thing of wanting to distill numbers to something that is comprehensible. The natural human reaction is just give me one number, right? Or three numbers if you really must. But you increase complexity by a factor of 3, not by, it's not 3 plus, it's 3 times if you get 3 numbers. So I think it's trying to learn about that, is trying to simplify things and get to the essence of the story. So that 13 trillion number about the size of the public sector spend with their suppliers, that was the bit that we did that research and we said, okay, no, this is the important bit. It's around, as you said, 12 to 13% of global GDP. A lot of that's in China, for example, and there are different procurement mechanisms in China. But at the heart of it, it's that 13 trillion, and that's a really nice thing to anchor off. I've got a friend who tried to sort of cover it as sort of like stacking dollar bills to the moon and back, and it doesn't work. Just it's 13 trillion. That's a lot of money. People get that. So I think simplicity.
Yeah, I like that very much. And you're quite right. The more numbers you throw at people, the more cognitive psychology 101 says that they put up at a wall and say, I can't hear you. I'm going to stay entrenched in my prior knowledge, and I don't want to hear. I do kind of counsel against, but you've done this very nicely. I do counsel against unqualified millions, billions, and trillions, because people don't tend to think in that way. But the fact that you're able to say that that's 1 in every 7 pounds, dollars, or yen spent on the planet. Okay, it's significant. It's very, very significant. Of course, I've got to have a Columbo question. Is there anything that about the way that you work with data that I haven't asked you that I should have done?
I don't know that you should have done. I think it puts the onus on you a little bit. But I think the work that what we've discovered, I can add a couple of insights, is that it is always that much harder to turn something from a concept. I can put these 2 spreadsheets together and I can demonstrate the hypothesis that these 2 data sources link, to implementing it at scale on a regular basis with some level of automation. The level of engineering work that is required to do that is very, very high. I mean, we could, for example, get to probably a rough estimate of the cost of waste per household in different councils across the UK, but it would take me 6 months to get there, to do it on a consistent, regular basis over and over again. And unless and until someone's actually going to put up some money to say, yes, we need to understand these variations, we can't do it. So I think there's always a real tendency there's something that needs to be overcome in data. Maybe AI can do this, which is to reduce, if we can, the cost of those experiments sufficient to allow us to go, hey, I've done a thing over here. Does that interest people? I think there's some really, if we can get to that stage where we can get AI to run over the data and I go, for this many households, this is the household data, tell me how much it costs per council to do waste per household. I think that would be really interesting to be able to get to that level.
And then, maybe you'll require a public sector, central government tender in order to be able to do that piece of work, perhaps in a rather meta way. But then being able to kind of have a league table that has East Renfrewshire in Glasgow at the top and, I don't know, West Surrey at the bottom, that'd be very interesting, very, very useful, really, really interesting. Brilliant. Now, listen, finally, Ian, where can our listeners find out about what you and Spend Network are up to online and in social media?
So we're at spendnetwork.com, and on all the social media channels, we're on Spend Network. So we're on Threads and LinkedIn and other places, less prevalent on Twitter these days. We run open ops where you can go and look for tender opportunities for free all around the world every day. So we're there, and you can use our services and see our data in action for free.
Perfect. Well, we'll include links to all of those in the show notes. Ian, thank you so much for your time, for sharing your approach to using data smarter. I think if only there were more people with your approach to tackling the challenges that data presents, there'd be rather less malarkey in the world of public sector procurement and rather more data-driven common sense. Perhaps no more 22 billions being peed up against the wall. Ian Makgill, Spend Network, thank you so much for joining us on Data Malarkey.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to Data Malarkey, the podcast about using data smarter. To find out what kind of data storyteller you are, why not take our data storytelling scorecard? It takes just 2 minutes to complete and will give you a personalized report right away. Visit data-storytelling.scoreapp.com or follow the link in the show notes.